I would
Okay.
like to start with a brief introduction in Ukrainian. First of all, thank you very much for introducing me and for inviting me. I am Jonathon Turnbull, and I've moved to Kiev in 2019 to do my PhD research in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. I am a geographer, and I also study the history of people returning to the Chernobyl exclusion zone and how those people interact or engage with animals. I've spent in Chernobyl 2 years, and I have been cooperating with environmentalists, with researchers and activists on the ground. We are also shooting a movie on dogs in the exclusion zone. Today, I would like to tell you about the findings of my research and tell you a number of stories about animals in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, focusing on dogs and wolves. And I will show you some of the pictures that I took there. Now I will switch to English. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your perfect Ukrainian introduction, and we are very much looking forward to listen about your research and your PhD thesis.
Thank you, thank you. So, as a cultural and environmental geographer, I'm interested in how different groups of people conceptualize, study, and represent nature. Writing in the 17th century, the French philosopher René Descartes proposed that animals are machines without the ability to think and feel. In contrast, Descartes believed that humans are the only creatures that possess a soul and therefore have the ability to think and feel. Since he wrote this incredibly influential
Johnny, can you please speak slowly? No, he cannot.
As innate, objective, and separate from humanity. This has been termed human exceptionalism, and it persists today in many different forms and can partly explain why the non-human world is objectified and exploited by human economic systems. More recently, though, a range of scholars in geography, anthropology, and philosophy have argued against Descartes' idea. They've refuted the idea that animals cannot feel, that humans are distinct from the rest of nature, and that there is any one fixed understanding of what nature actually is. Indeed, as geographers like Noel Castry, Sarah Watmore, and Jamie Lorimer have argued, the meaning of nature is contested by different groups of people, including scientists. Nature is perhaps one of the most complicated words to define in the English language, and has come to mean both everything and nothing. So why does it matter how we define nature anyway? Well, ideas around nature are extremely influential in making decisions about how we should live and what constitutes acceptable actions and behaviors. For instance, whether an item of food is considered natural or not is significant for many consumers. Indeed, the term unnatural might be a synonym for that which is not right or proper, or even just bad or wrong. Historically, oppressed and marginalized human communities and behaviors have been described as unnatural, as a way of controlling them or eradicating them. So how we define nature has serious consequences for people's lives. Second, the idea of wilderness is powerful in Western culture. Wilderness has been imagined as a place outside of the human world, far away, a refuge from industry and expanding urban space. As William Cronin argued in his famous essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, wilderness, like nature, is a human creation, it's an idea. When you look at the history of this idea, specifically what wilderness means and what or who it is for, the idea has changed over time and led to various ways of managing the environment. The idea of nature and wilderness as faraway places diverts attention away from aspects of nature that exist closer to home, like in cities, while also creating wilderness spaces as a space where certain humans are able to retreat to get a break from human or city life. Human communities that live in places considered to be wilderness, like indigenous peoples, have also been naturalized, imagined as less than human and treated accordingly by colonizing forces. So this brief introduction, I hope, has convinced you that when we think about nature, we're not talking about something objective, but rather something which has a contested meaning that is different for different people in different places and times. A geographical approach is therefore useful for understanding how nature is understood at Chernobyl. As the anthropologist Joseph Masco suggests, nuclear landscapes are often impossible to entirely remediate or return to pre-nuclear conditions. Combined with the tendency for governments to designate such sites as protected nature reserves, this leads to the development of what Masco terms mutant ecologies, which emerge in the aftermath of nuclear tests and accidents. In such spaces, even though the type of contamination changes over time, and can be relatively small in comparison to what was originally released into the environment, the nuclear signature of nuclear reserves could change the biological structure of plants and animals over time, making the deep future of the radioactive wildlife preserve as a naturally and socially valued space an open question. Nature in such spaces, then, is often considered to be novel, and the meaning of it is contested. So in this presentation, I want to point to a number of ways in which nature has been understood at Chernobyl through three key examples from popular culture. As we've already heard from a number of scientists, some of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting, interviewing, and working with before, I'm going to start by very briefly outlining the ongoing scientific controversy that exists in Chernobyl to set the scene. I start with scientists because they are usually the people that we go to for information about nature, and in Chernobyl, they have very different ideas concerning how nature has been affected by radiation in the 35 years since the nuclear catastrophe of 1986. By examining how these different ideas emerge, it's possible to reflect on what happens to the concept of nature when it becomes radioactive. That is, what happens to the idea of pristine and pure nature separate from humanity when it's contaminated with the material debris of human society for thousands of years into the future. As this key paper shows from 2019, some of the leading radioecologists are attempting to solve a long-running dispute in Chernobyl science. Radioecology is a branch of science that studies the effects of radiation on biological systems and how radioisotopes move through the environment. During my fieldwork, I've spoken to as many of the key researchers as possible involved in this controversy, from Ukraine, Belarus, the US, the UK, Finland, Spain, and more, and some of them are here today. I just want to briefly mention what this controversy is, some of the reasons it exists, and what people are trying to do to solve it. The Chernobyl Forum report, published by the International Atomic Energy Agency in 2006, concluded that populations of many plants and animals have expanded, and the present environmental conditions have had a positive impact on the biota in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. In a paper published in 2016 in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the authors Anders Moller and Tim Mousseau challenged this opinion. They write that the findings of their own field studies in the zone challenge reports in the popular media and the conclusions of the Chernobyl Forum report, and are of relevance today given the recent interest in returning contaminated lands to agricultural use and the renaissance of the global nuclear power industry. For Mousseau and Moller, the Chernobyl Forum report was based on limited information from the Western peer-reviewed scientific literature, implying a lack of fieldwork by the authors. In contrast to this, Moller and Mousseau have conducted fieldwork on dozens of species in the zone, from spiders to bees to grasshoppers, a range of raptors and other birds, microbes and other things. Most notable, though, has been their work on barn swallows. Moller has conducted extremely extensive work on barn swallows since 1970, attaching rings to the legs of several thousand birds over the course of his career. He's a leading expert on the species and trained as a biologist and zoologist. Like me, the historian Kate Brown also conducted fieldwork in the zone with Moller and Mousseau, as she learned to read the more than human landscape of Chernobyl for signs of disturbance. For Brown, the work of Moller and Mousseau is different to that of most Western scientists conducting Chernobyl nature research. Like the pair themselves note in the paper I mentioned earlier, Brown points out that a lot of influential Chernobyl studies took place in laboratories around the world using simulations and controlled conditions. In contrast, Moller and Mousseau, as well as a range of Ukrainian researchers, are interested in the effects of man-made radiation on the free-roaming wild organisms that live in the zone today. As Brown accompanied them, she gained a certain literacy or an ability to read the landscape. For instance, she recounts noticing that in certain areas the forest does not smell like a forest. Looking around, she noticed the dry brown leaves on the floor that were piling up and not rotting or decaying like they normally do. She learned that this piled up leaf litter was not decaying because the creatures that instigate these decaying processes, such as microbes, worms, and other insects, are either absent from the area or are unable to work well in areas with high levels of radioactive contamination. So instead, the leaves just accumulate on the floor year after year. The reason behind this, however, is worth paying attention to. Often, any abnormalities in nature at Chernobyl are put down to the effects of radiation. Moller and Mousseau are both heavily criticized by others in the radioecological community for being quick to relate any sign of abnormality to radiation when a whole host of other factors are also at play. Here then, others have suggested to me in the field that the absence of microbes in the leaf litter is not due to radiation, but rather because a large layer of topsoil was scraped away during the cleanup operation in 1986, removing many of the organisms that lived there that have since not recovered. To paint a broad picture, Radioecologists are often rooted in the scientific discipline of physics. They are experts at dosimetry and measuring where radioisotopes are and how they move through ecosystems. We can see this logic expressed in the work of Valery Kashparov at the Ukrainian Academy of Agricultural Sciences, who's paid intense detail to the transfer of radionuclides from soil to plants to animals and to humans, and evaluated specific calculations for how much radiation may be permissibly registered in a product. Ukraine actually has the most diverse rules for this out of any country, with different permissible levels for bread, milk, meat, berries, mushrooms, and on, whereas most countries have just a standard measure for, say, meat and milk. Whilst radioecologists may be experts at dosimetry, that's measuring radiation, as previously mentioned, they have studied the impacts of radiation on wild organisms in less depth in the field, and there's a need for further study. On the other hand, radiobiologists, in contrast to radioecologists, are accused of inadequate skills in dosimetry, such as Moller and Mousseau, who are regularly criticized for not measuring radiation accurately. They're also criticized for calculating dose rates and the radiation exposure of wild animals in the field inaccurately. This is the main critique leveled at their work, but again, as Brown points out, they have great expertise in biology, genetics, and evolution. So there's a bit of a mismatch going on between the expertise of each group, with radioecologists being good at measuring radiation, but not necessarily studying it in the field as much, and what we might call radiobiologists being good at looking for effects, but not measuring the dose. A couple of other critiques have been raised concerning the field studies at Chernobyl. It's important to recognize that the zone is very unevenly contaminated, so the location of each study really matters, and should be disclosed so that the relevant conclusions can be made. Those in the most contaminated parts, like the Red Forest, which is relatively small compared to the entire zone, cannot always be used to speak on behalf of the entire territory, which some researchers tend to do. And finally, there's lots of uncertainties concerning the models used to estimate the effects of low doses of radiation and the effects of very low doses, which is what much of the wildlife in Chernobyl actually experiences. And this, again, has been understudied. The current models in radiation protection and radioecology are constantly being reshaped as this research continues. As such, we have a situation where physicists and biologists have been producing knowledge on the health of nature in the zone, but their divergent responses can be explained by their different methods, approaches, and lines of questions, with radioecologists focusing on the distribution and transfer of radionuclides, and radiobiologists focusing on the biological endpoints of radiation. So these differences lead to drastically different interpretations of nature in the zone. For instance, many of the radioecology researchers suggest that human presence is far worse for wildlife than radiation, whereas some of the radiobiologists pay more attention to individuals and the effects on species. The former notion here was encapsulated when the famous philosopher and environmentalist James Lovelock suggested that putting nuclear waste inside nature reserves was a good idea if we are to foster the conservation of threatened ecosystems because it would deter other land uses, and I think this is quite a problematic idea. So there are many who are now working hard to bridge this gap, including people like Jermaine Oriozola, Mike Wood, Sergei Gashchak, Catherine Rains, my colleagues on the panel here today, and many others in the UK, the US, Ukraine, Belarus, and Japan, amongst many other countries. So an interdisciplinary approach is clearly necessary if this scientific controversy is to be solved. So having just talked about why scientists disagree about the state of nature in the zone, I now want to briefly mention a few other ways in which nature has been represented to open up the debate to cultural and political interpretations. First, I'm going to point to the exhibition, Arc Chernobyl, by Ukrainian photographer and artist Denis Kopylov. The exhibition involved placing photographs of charismatic fauna printed on large canvases inside the zone and photographing the resulting scene. The animals pictured include lions, gorillas, giraffes, cheetahs, polar bears, penguins, which were taken during Kopylov's various trips around the world. These animals can be considered hyper-charismatic, that is, extremely photographable and popular amongst the general public, and are those most commonly associated with romantic ideas concerning wilderness, as I kind of discussed in the introduction earlier. So as Kopylov told me, he decided that the zone was like Noah's Ark. The Ark itself is radiation, said Kopylov, which is protecting animals and nature from people. It's helping nature come back to its original standards of development. So here, we see a version of nature that is separate from humans, echoing the comments of the philosopher James Lovelock that I just mentioned, that's where radiation is seen as less harmful to nature than the presence of humanity. So while Kopylov specifically wants to project a positive image concerning the zone, advocating in his project that the zone itself is turned into a national park, nature is taken here at the broad scale instead of a local one, where the molecular effects of radiation are not really taken into account. So next I want to discuss a very different example. Fear the Wolves video game released in 2019 by Vostok Games is set in Chernobyl. As the developers write, the howls of mutated creatures echo through the wasteland. Wolves, and much worse, lay in wait for foolish players who don't keep their wits about them. In the trailer, mutant wolves can be seen chasing down armed human players who are battling not only each other, but the hostile radioactive environment and its creatures. This example constructs...
цей приклад показує нам крайобраз, де природа насправді зазнала шкоди від радіації. Це дуже намальовнича картинка. В таких випадках ми бачимо ефект Годзіли. Дуже багато людей думає, що радіація – це мутація. Вони не можуть думати за процеси. Таке видовище – це фетишизація процесу або приховування процесів.
Leads to harmful mutations that are usually visible and kind of uncanny. The Godzilla effect applies readily to popular representations of Chernobyl nature, but also, according to some researchers, to the ways some scientists approach their research in the zone. As a biologist working in the zone told me, the way in which researchers title their work is important because if a journalist reads something like impact of radiation on immune system of Chernobyl birds, their mind immediately goes to the negative impacts. And in many cases, you read the scientific paper and realize that they didn't actually find any. Certain researchers have presented their findings in ways that are misleading, playing up to this media spectacle to circulate their work through the press. I want to turn now to the YouTube account BioNerd23. In her videos, she can be seen eating apples from trees in Chernobyl, picking up fragments of nuclear waste with her bare hands, and encountering animals in the zone like foxes. These videos compare and contrast to aspects of the previously mentioned projects. Unlike the video game, BioNerd23 wants to move away from ideas concerning mutants. Instead of creating fear, she wants to dispel fear and remove it. And similar to Kopylov, BioNerd23 wants to counter the idea that nature in Chernobyl is unsafe, and does so by using her own body as the experimental device. In these videos, she's making radiation natural, making it part of nature and part of the natural environment, not something to be feared. As anthropologist Shiro Krupa writes, however, toxicity is being tacked on to nature, which naturalizes pollution and contamination. And this is not necessarily a good thing, as it allows contamination and pollution to become normalized rather than approached critically, tried to be remediated or avoided altogether. And very briefly and finally, I want to offer a brief conclusion from my own work. Last year, I went to the zone and gave as many of the checkpoint guards that I could find cameras to document their lives with the dogs that live in the zone. This population of dogs that were originally abandoned after the accident, and the descendants have since populated the zone. The aim of this project was to show that nature is not something that needs to be turned into a grand spectacle, but rather can be something that we find close to us every day and can be domestic as well as kind of wild, romantic notions of wilderness. Through these photographs and interviews with the guards, I was able to get a sense of how life goes on in Chernobyl and how people negotiate living with radiation on an everyday level, not as something to be feared, but also not as something to be naturalized, nor turned into a positive thing. So something kind of negotiated on an everyday level. So I hope I've demonstrated how a geographical approach offers a useful contribution to understanding nature at Chernobyl and points out the various different aspects from the local, the everyday, all the way to the landscape level. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Дуже дякую.
So thank you very much, Johnny. It was a perfect conclusion for our panel today, because we've been discussing quite a lot, about all of the research going on in Chernobyl and all of the attitudes of different sciences toward the situation in Chernobyl. And just to conclude your presentation, what do you think? Are people in Chernobyl are mostly optimistic, or they share quite a pessimistic point of view?
I would say that out of all of the scientists that I've spoken to, I'd say the vast majority are positive about the way wildlife is now kind of flourishing in the zone to an extent. But as I try to highlight, there is another group of scientists that really disagree with this idea. And it really depends where you look, I think. If you're interested in the presence of animals, we've seen the first brown bear in the region for 100 years, which is a good thing. But then if you're interested in genetic effects, which is kind of different, in some places in the zone, in small, really contaminated areas, you can find effects. So I think trying to say whether it's positive or negative is a difficult question because it really just depends what you're interested in, what you're researching, and what you're trying to look at.
Thank you. And also a broader question. So by any chance, maybe you contacted with some researchers who were actually doing the research in Fukushima. As here, this exclusion zone is actually exclusion. So we are not going to come back there. Where in Fukushima, we are actually going, people are going to come back there, and the profile of research is quite different. So can you maybe compare the attitude of people, just a normal people, towards Chernobyl and Fukushima?
So I have spoken with some researchers that have worked in Fukushima, and the political and economic context is very different. And also the material circumstances are very different. Chernobyl was a lot more contaminated. So I think Japan has a very different idea of remediation. It's a smaller territory, and it's just a different cultural and political context. I haven't done enough research to give like a kind of accurate comment on this. So I would just point out that it's a very different political and economic context and a cultural context as well.
Thank you very much. I will continue to asking you, I'm sorry about the Fukushima, because earlier with Professor Yasuda, we were talking quite a lot that people keep comparing Chernobyl and Fukushima because of obvious reasons. But then if you would look on the different context, on the different time scale, on the different technical opportunities, it is a really like two completely different accidents. Would you support my statement, or would you say that they're more or less similar?
I think I would probably support your statement that they are different contextually, politically, economically, culturally, but also materially as well. It's a different size territory, different level of contamination. It was also compounded by a tsunami. So it's very different, and I think that scientists and cultural scholars should really pay attention to those differences rather than just tending to see every kind of nuclear landscape as the same. I think each one deserves scientific and geographical, anthropological attention to understand, the natural effects on nature, but also how the communities living with the after effects of these disasters were affected too.
So you again delivered a really wonderful research story about the radiophobia and also about the different perception of the accident in Chernobyl by researchers and by the computer development studios. If I may ask, what is your attitude towards all of these, scary movies and scary games about Chernobyl? I'm not saying about some documentaries, while I'm just saying, about this kind of stalker games and Beware the Wolves. They are turning Chernobyl a little bit into Disneyland. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, so this is a big theme in my dissertation actually, is how nature at Chernobyl has become this spectacle, has become this thing that is to be looked at from outside, and it kind of covers over a lot of the reality. People are much more interested in stories of three-headed animals and mutations than they are of what's actually going on in the zone with real people and real animals. And this is part of the reason that I wanted to focus on the lives of the dogs, which both kind of scientists don't really consider to be wildlife, but also people aren't so interested in them for the kind of big genetic effect, and they're not really mutants. They just look like everyday animals. And so I thought trying to move away from this spectacle towards kind of domestic, everyday nature was an interesting way of doing this. But I think there's like a number of films, movies, games that really play up to that spectacle. And I think when we're asking, are they good or bad, it really it depends who is affected by these and if they are affected. So some scientists have told me that they really don't like these representations because it harms the people that continue to live in and around the zone, and really troubles the kind of attempts at moving back in towards the edges. So there's a scientist making a product called atomic vodka, and his idea is that he wants to grow grain inside the zone, produce vodka, and sell it on a global market, much like Biomed 23, to kind of show that nature is consumable and it's not this big scary thing. But I think there was a Ukrainian film recently called Brahma, which I think I'm saying that right. I think it means gateway in English, which I think actually did quite a really interesting job of representing kind of local culture, the Policia region, and the zone. So I think there are good examples of this as well.
Thank you. And have you? It's just my question. Have you had the opportunity to read The Roadside Picnic by Strugatsky brothers? Probably most of the researchers would address to this book. So have you read it in English?
You know, I have the book, but I'm really embarrassed because it's been sitting on my shelf and I haven't read it. But I know what it's about, and I've been meaning to read it for a long time. And I've kind of been saving it towards the end to read kind of casually as I'm writing my thesis. But I'm really interested in the Stalker, and I'm a big fan of Tarkovsky in general. So it's really interesting to trace kind of the connection between Roadside Picnic, Chernobyl, Stalker, and then more recently there's a set of books by an American sci-fi author called Jeff Vandermeer, who writes about Area X as this landscape that's been kind of all the people have been removed and nature's been recovered, which to me kind of relates directly to Roadside Picnic, to Stalker. I think there's kind of an emerging genre of research, literature that is really kind of fascinated in a strange way by these emptied or abandoned landscapes and how nature returns. But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to read this book soon.
Okay, so thank you very much. And thank you very much for your presentation and our discussion.